Hello everyone, today we talk about Charles IV of Bohemia, the heart of 14th century Europe. I wanted to make a 14th century Bohemian history video for our historical regional series that for kingdoms in general I tend to make for a century at a time. But I realized that the figure of Charles IV is so central, and at large, like Bohemian history also had some interesting ups and downs in the later Middle Ages. It's very important to concentrate on this reign alone that can serve at large for the broader 14th century Bohemian symbol of power and magnificence. We will see beyond. This is a real giant. In late medieval history, we discussed Bohemian history already from the original series. In fact, by going in chronological order, we arrived to this point. We will talk more about the Hussites. This is a kingdom that deserves and a crown also extending beyond the kingdom of Bohemia itself. It really deserves much greater attention. This could also be the start, which has already started actually, but not serially. In fact, of a playlist on specific medieval rulers, right, which can help, of course, next to the political and the territorial dimension, like properly in the person, in the actions of these individuals, to explain our Europe. It's also very hard just to make a brief introductory video about this figure. It's sort of weird that I think we just made a couple of videos about the Luxembourgs to begin with. One was about the rise of Charles IV. If anything, that's the only thing that we covered in some depth about him. We often reference to him, also to his father's exploit in Italy, the fight in the Battle of Crécy, something that we'll partly see today as far as Charles is concerned. There is a deeper legacy, the one of Henry VII of Luxembourg, Charles' grandfather, but also the Premislid one, as Charles was, from his mother's side, descendant, in fact, of the famous Bohemian monarchic house that wielded so much power in the previous centuries. Plus, he also descended from the Habsburgs that would actually be his rivals during his reign. And so it's a very intertwined picture that is also quite typically representing princely Germany, even though Bohemia was technically not Germany, but at large, like in this, especially later Middle Ages, it's now fully within the German system, even as a mostly, but not only, Slavic land. I will try my best. So Charles IV of Luxembourg, originally named Wenceslaus, also because of the fact of the Czech legacy of the Premislid house. Remember, this was a French dynasty. They spoke French, as a matter of fact. They came from the western part of the empire, right? They were Lorrainese, Burgundian, at least in the broader synecdoche. Actually, those lands had nothing to do with Burgundy historically, and especially yet, right? Because these would eventually be part of the state of Burgundy. I made a video on, but it had, there was a classicistic tendency of calling these lands in between France and Germany at a point, Burgundy, even though they had nothing to do nor with the kingdom, not with the duchy of Burgundy, as if this were sort of a different people. In part, it was even true. Now, Charles reigned as Holy Roman Emperor from 1355 until his death in 1378. These are very important times in history. From one side, you have the crisis of the mid 14th century, a very important redrawing, as you know, the political and territorial assets of the major princes in Europe, which is very challenging, especially for a universal authority like the Holy Roman Imperial one. From the other side, you have the gradual, opening of Europe, even towards a Renaissance tendency, the crisis also of the Papal Schism, the difficulty of keeping points of reference together. We'll talk more about also Charles' descendants. In any case, as we've seen in the aforementioned video, in 1346, Charles was elected King of Germany and King of the Romans. At this point, in many ways, they came together. Concurrently, he became King of Bohemia, assuming the title of Charles I for that crown. Aside from the empires, of course, the Bohemian crown was the most important one, reason for which, throughout his life, Charles highlighted his connection with the priestly lineage, and partly due to his preference for his Bohemian heritage, which included 2 saints among his direct ancestors. Princes care very much about this, especially when, as we will see with the most famous Golden Bull, the entire German asset is going to be redrawn on the basis of this princely partition as a sum of provincial and ultimately regional estates. Right? We will now explain better how and why. If anything, I made lots of videos about the comparison between the crowns of Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland, especially. Germany, of course, fits in the broader picture, so you have enough, as you know, playlists, especially about Slavic Europe, about medieval Germany, to look at, because the Luxembourg settlement in Bohemia had started with Henry VII, of course, corresponds to a very specific dynamic that occurs at this point with the Habsburgs, with other rulers, even the Hohenzollern to a degree, the Angevins in Hungary, we've seen it recently, all, say, shifting towards lands that were actually less developed, but in this sense more manageable for especially like an attempted power concentration. This wouldn't be too successful on the longer run because all these monarchies fail in an elective direction, but also for different reasons that at this point could still be changed. So they were actually making the right, the sovereigns were making the right investment. Consider that in Germany, like Bohemia was truly a kingdom on its own. Like it within the empire, just like the Italian one, the Burgundian one, and so it had this enhanced level of influence ever since it had become de facto an elector of the empire, which would be sanctioned exactly under Charles IV, being more important than, for example, the same Habsburgic Austria, reason for which Robert IV essentially forges this privilege of his house to bear the title of Archdukes of Austria, because even though Austria would never eventually be an elector, as the Golden Bull was, never to be touched again because of the entrenched prerogatives of the German princes in that direction, there were, of course, other ways to circumvent that. In fact, the Habsburgs would finally become Holy Roman Emperors for good, fundamentally. But it was a way to inspire to this higher status that had been stripped from the Habsburgs by the Luxembourgs, in part also the Wittelsbachs, that did not like the Luxembourgs very much, but had more issues with their Austrian neighbors. But we will see this. We have already seen it. To talk about Bavaria, we talk about Austria. Definitely, that's not going to be the end of it on Schwerpunkt for sure. So, being the eldest son of John of Bohemia, who was the king of Bohemia and Count of Luxembourg, as well as a very peculiar guy, he should have thought better to consolidate most of this vast territory that his house had managed to control. Instead, he lived literally as a knight errant from Lithuania to Italy, from Bohemia to France. But we will see this, if anything, when we will make a video about him. Charles dealt with the loss of his father, who perished at the Battle of Crécy, a battle in which the same Charles would be wounded from the French side that, as you know, suffered a catastrophic defeat. We will talk about Crécy, if anything. I made Poitiers anyhow. Recently we talked about the Duke of Athens, Gautier of Brienne, when talking about the history of Florence, that is deeply intertwined with the one of Charles IV. In his Italian policy, Walter died at Crécy as well, So you find this interesting, anecdotes, including the Florentine longbowman from the English side that would have allegedly struck the same Walter, remembering his insult to Florence, according to Boccaccio anyway. But this is also the cultural temper of the times. We will see Charles will have a very strong, holy, Catholic, apostolic, and Roman duty. He had a very strong relation with Italy, where he had already been with his father in arms. He would be, as you know, connected with Petrarch, with Rienzi. So there is here an attempt, like also to restore good relations with the papacy after the dreadful parenthesis between John the 22nd and Ludwig of Wittelsbach, the latter which had opposed Charles' rise to power. Charles' mother, Elizabeth, Queen of Bohemia, was sister of Wenceslaus III, the last male ruler of the Przemysl dynasty, who governed both Bohemia and Poland. Very characteristic again of this Central European monarchy is the attempt, especially in this time in history, the attempt to collect multiple crowns at a time because of the increasing difficulty of actually carrying out a centralizing policy within the same, and just trying to do so by getting a tiny bit of surplus from more crowns that would have thus also legitimized each other dynastically by sharing the same blood, which is again typically late medieval, before like monarchies would fight against one another. At this point it's mostly a matter of consolidating a hierarchy and elite, also at a increasingly international level. Upon his father's death on the battlefields of France, Charles inherited the county of Luxembourg and was elected as king of the kingdom of Bohemia, with his coronation taking place on September the 2nd, 1347. Just think of what was happening, like especially in the following year, from, say, a sanitary point of view in the world. But this is in fact the very, actually a very dark time in history, which, however, like Charles in his court in Prague, his king really shine through as a testament to the continuation of the Imperial Catholic tradition. On July the 11th, 1346, Charles was chosen also as King of the Romans, the famous title of Rex Romanorum, so the would-be Holy Roman Emperor, which was particularly important considering the German power struggle of the time. In fact, Louis IV was already Holy Roman Emperor. We're talking Ludwig the Bavarian, so a man that had been in Rome, actually had been fully crowned. He had had those struggles with the papacy and was also a very successful ruler in his own regard, right? Munich was one of the other great centers emerging in an otherwise very sort of decentralized Germany, especially after the demise of the monarchy, of the monarchic state at least. And therefore Charles' rise to power was a very powerful statement against the Wittelsbachs. His crowning occurred on November the 26th, 1336 in Bonn, in Western Germany. After his rival's death, he was re-elected in 1349 and crowned again as King of the Romans. Ludwig was old, so Charles is another generation, the newer generation. But until the Wittelsbach's death, objective was very difficult to contend power, such a strong opponent. In 1355, Charles was eventually crowned King of Italy and Holy Roman Emperor, right, in northern Italy and in Rome, respectively, of course. His ascension to the title of King of Burgundy in 1365 made him also the personal ruler over all the kingdoms within the Holy Roman Empire, which was the first time happening in history. Simply because, not because there haven't been kings of Bohemia were also Holy Roman Emperor. In fact, his grandfather had been, but Henry VII, in fact, had not been King of Burgundy. It had not been crowned. So here imagine you are king of all, like you're Holy Roman Emperor, King of Bohemia, King of Germany, King of Italy, King of Burgundy. This is very important, also in an ideological sense. Charles had a crucial influence in the political and cultural landscape of Europe, not just the one of the Kingdom of Bohemia, making him also a very significant historical figure in the Czech Republic. I mean, Prague is in many ways all about him. Even in institutions that came later, that even rose up against the monarchy at the time, were titled after him, maintain like his effigies and such. But let's say Charles IV is very much Prague and the true heart of 14th century Europe. Some of you asked me, because I made a very old video stating this, and some of you asked me, what does that actually mean? Well, in part, after this video, it will be clearer. As we were saying before, there's other major chapter in late medieval history, the Golden Bull of 1356, which represents a major shift in the political framework of the Holy Roman Empire. This was Charles' creation, essentially to remold the political landscape of Germany, especially so defining the prerogatives of the various German princes, as well as fundamentally entrenching the electoral power of the Kingdom of Bohemia in a way that would leave out the Habsburgs. There was also at this point a dependency of the Wittelsbachs on the Luxembourgs because of the fragmentation after Ludwig IV of the Bavarian house into, as you know, up to 4 branches that eventually occupied other territories, other electorates out there, including Brandenburg, the Palatinate, etc. And so there was a very negotiated political balance that would essentially grant Charles in his realm a central role in the region. Nonetheless, some aspects of Charles' legacy also remain debated. The image of Charles as a wise, devout, and peace-loving ruler is a portrayal that he also partially crafted for himself, and that yet has, I would say, deservedly a lasting impact, and is reinforced by numerous artistic and scholarly works that showcase a deep traditional belief by the side of Charles in a time in which the universal order had been subverted. Charles erected himself as the pacifier, the guy who would bring the empire and the papacy together after the strong fracture under Ludwig IV that had basically disconfessed the Pope, not the papacy as such, but essentially had also boasted some uniquely German prerogatives as far as the local monarchy an empire was actually concerned. This stemming from very exasperated ideological struggles, but also a sort of degeneration in the overall order that was very palpable all across Europe and beyond at the time because of the major demographic contraction, the economic shrinking. So a time that was difficult for everybody involved. Think about plague. There was literally a redrawing of the internal European axes and assets. We'll understand this better, which, for example, regions were spared from the plague, what centrality Avignon had, especially at this time in that particular location in Europe, in these international connections. Well, Charles was really the ruler that, even just from a personal point of view, held this bigger ecumenic system all together, right? A truly gigantic effort, and also a successful one at large, not just because his reign was substantially long, but because Prague really was, in this sense, the cornerstone, the spring of pumped blood into the vessels of this now stunned and ever more fragmented European picture. We will talk more about the second half of the 14th century. Sometimes, I made so many videos, now several hundreds, about medieval Europe, but there is always some particular period, generation, era that we haven't covered so well, and it's difficult to express like the sense of doom incumbent on Europe after the Black Death. This is the period of soldiers of fortune, of mercenary companies ravaging the continent. You can argue that at some point Charles had been part of it with his father as well, but there is a very precarious balance that only the more shrewd and sort of capable, competent rulers can handle at this point. And at this level of ecumenic vision, truly only Charles stands out. France is in crisis. Italy is now basically on its own. The various mercenary bands, like lots from Germany, are really roaming all around. It's difficult to maintain an order with the Turks swarming to the Balkans, etc. Now, Charles was born to, as we've seen, John of Bohemia from the Luxembourg dynasty and Queen Elizabeth from Bohemia, from the Bohemian Przemysl dynasty, in Prague. He was thus quite attached to the city. Charles' maternal grandfather was King Wenceslaus II of Bohemia. At his confirmation, he chose the name Charles in honor of his uncle, who was the King Charles IV of France, under whose court he had actually lived for 7 years. This was also very importantly formative moment, given that France was was going under some problem, as you know, and as the same Luxembourgs found out by supporting the French in their really first debacle during the 100 Years' War. Even more, France, as you know, what we talk about this very often, was the together with, Paris, together with Rome, with Naples, really the wealth engine, papal axis that contrasted the more obstinate Ghibelline Germanic faction. And Charles had this chance, being a Frenchman himself, but also partly Slavic, and generally speaking Germanized at large, to reunite this fractured world by, as we've seen in Germany, essentially fighting against the greater responsible for this ideological push against the papacy, against sort of the ecumenic mission of the empire, and restoring therefore specific relations with the papacy that now importantly resided in Avignon, that is not close, let's say, to Bohemia, but in some ways the fact of being located, as you know, on the Rhone, at the boundary exactly between the Holy Roman Empire and France, projected the papal court towards a more Central European dimension. That, of course, was very close to the court of Paris, where Charles, as we've seen, was partly brought up during his youth, habituating the young prince to a specific mission, but also properly to understand the political implications of such power struggle and connections and clienteles. Charles thus received education in French and became proficient in 5 languages that are thus the same: French, Latin, Czech, German, and Italian. This would be so crucial for obvious reasons. These languages incarnated at the time, like essentially most of European civilization. In 1331, Charles gained military experience in Italy alongside his father. We'll talk about this. Essentially, they were called into, or at least they took advantage of the power struggle between the northern Italian Ghibelline signories, the papal legate Bertrand de Bourget, in a context in which still at the time, like the Bavarian had been in Italy several years before, but was still very attempted regarding everything taking place, including, eventually the clash between Venice and Florence against the Veronese, the role of the thousands of German mercenaries employed in Italian service that the Wittelsbach was trying to sort of maintain their control on, even when they were employed among well forces that actually told him to go blip himself. So there's this almost fairy tale kind of adventure of the Luxembourgs into Italy, because they entered there, and there is some apparent paradox. That is to say, a Germanic house that at that point aligns with a papal legate, and because of these previous connections, but also endowed with ambitions on their own. Most of the activity took place in northern Italy, but Charles, at the start of 1333, visited Lucca in northwest Tuscany. We talked about this just the other day in the video about medieval Florence, as this city was very much like a strategic pawn, battled over by the Florentines and the Pisans, and also the Scaliger dynasty had been once taken over by some German knights and sold to the highest bidder. In fact, the Luxembourgs really Charles is also independent from his father at the point, and he solidifies his rule there. Right, the following year there was the Battle of San Felice, in which Charles manages to defeat the Este with his Modenese reinforcements, and he went there just with the classical hundreds of men-at-arms from Central Europe that are, as we've seen, also very much already employed in northern Italy, especially at this point. And he essentially manages to establish some control, some temporary control over some of these communes that essentially pay for his own protection. Right, most of these expeditions now are completely funded by the Italians. It's not more like the Germanic expedition to subdue the peninsula. It's more like this tiny contingents, really, as it had been also for the Bavarian initially, etc. I'd say seeking the protection of, especially the smaller cities, seeking the protection from the bigger signories that are swallowing everything by supporting with their money these. In fact, important also nobiliar figures was royal blood. Charles famously establishes a fortress near to Lucca and founds the town of Monte Carlo, which in Italian means Charles Mountain, in defense of the city. Fortifications, entrenchment, this is also very typical of the era, with the crisis that is about to arrive. The 30s are already showing that signs of exhaustion all across Eurasia. There is a coming back to landed assets, so to say, and to much sort of greater territorial control, fortification, not more like a floating empire over so many powers at once. Beginning in 1333, Charles took charge of the Bohemian crown's lands due to his father's frequent absences and worsening eyesight. As you know, on the battlefield of Crecy, the old Bohemian king fought blind, right? Because he had already lost his eyesight completely, had himself tied to the other fighters, and he died fighting blind, right? Blind fury, you can argue. In the midst of the fray. By 1334, Charles was granted the title of Margrave of Moravia, a customary title held by heirs to the throne that had been typical, in Czech history. The Bohemian part was normally, with Prague, of course, was de facto the center of the kingdom, the more advanced, more prosperous era. And Moravia was given either to the brother, especially in the earlier days, or more recently to the son of the king. And it's very interesting to look at already the scale of international involvement, like having this massive Czech estates, with their own particular customs, their tradition, their sort of difficult political issues, and taking off, right, going over to Italy in the center, in the north, like managing to see this Holy Roman Imperial ensemble and constantly negotiating with the other powers around. This is such a great school for Charles during his princely years. In 1336, Charles also took over governance of Tyrol for his brother John Henry, quickly becoming embroiled in a conflict over control of the county. I made a video about the county of Tyrol explaining this, that there were lots of issues with the Gorizia branch connected in turn to southeast Germany, antagonizing. Plus, there were lots of episcopal lands. It's important for the papacy as well. This was also, in many ways, the gateway to northeastern Italy that at the point was very, very active in imperial Ghibelline policy with the Della Scala that had basically the second largest military in Europe after the Kingdom of France, and control, in fact, the Adige, the Etsch Valley for this the Central European expeditions towards the south, towards Italy. And so there was all an attempt to secure, right, that valley in order to guarantee to this sense that the Bohemian crown, at least easier access. It was even more difficult considering it was Bavaria in between. Like, you understand the issues. Consider at this point Ludwig IV is still there. He exercises a lot of power all around. Now, on July the 11th, 1346, following an alliance formed by his father and Pope Clement VI, who was a staunch opponent of Emperor Louis IV, Charles was elected as Roman king by some prince-electors at Rennes, in the west, in the Palatinate. This, of course, entailed specific allegiance to the papacy that was showed by Charles pledging his loyalty to Clement, in turn receiving significant concessions from the emperor in 1347, reaffirming the papal ownership of extensive territories in central and northern Italy. This matter had been key to essentially ensure obedience, like good relations of the emperors towards the Pope, so more or less showing what the next sovereign field, right, of play would have been. It would have been, in fact, at this point, unrealistic just to try to recover the papal states at large, even the same control over the Italic kingdom at large, right? Eventually, Charles would be king of Italy and Holy Roman Emperor, but it's difficult to stress, especially in a year like 1347, how degraded now the sort of all the international forces were at this point. Like, everybody was witnessing the shrinking of their own previous power, including the papacy, the empire. So this dynamic between Charles and Clement is quite exemplificative of that dynamic I was hinting at before concerning the mutual recognition of international powers within Europe for cooperating against, in this sense, common rivals. Because it was impossible even from the Wittelsbach side to reassert like a control in Italy. Again, Ludwig had been, differently from Charles' grandfather, being very practical, very realistic. He had gone to Italy. He had, tried to kidnap, to control everything he could along the way, but he did so just to swiftly get to Rome, being crowned Holy Roman Emperor, coming back to Germany after having tried to take Milan, failing, and was it, right? The times of Henry VII, we've seen it again the other day in that video about Florence in the early 14th century. had been massive, had been a huge campaign with strong forces that was in the 10th of the 14th century, was still properly at the peak of the great medieval civilization. But at this point, properly the resources of manpower, financial availability were absent, were not there. There was no way to carry out any major political, territorial reconquest, reorganization. It was just mostly about setting the boundaries within which, right, the specific effort was being funneled at a local level. But it's not like these international movements were not, in fact, needed for it, right? And Charles' presence in Italy throughout this time was crucial, also because he had yet to be crowned. He was now just now elevated by the Pope as such. By the way, Charles vowed on this occasion to nullify Louis' actions against Clement, avoid interference in Italian matters at least in an anti-papal direction, and support and protect the Church, in fact, in the process. In other words, the Pope bought himself a valid aid against his more direct opponent on the political scene. Charles IV faced significant challenges he wasn't yet Charles IV, right, because he had to be crowned as such, but let's call it Charles, had to now, having received the papal support, however, spend it in order to affirm himself into Germany, otherwise he could have not ruled at any point. Even as the Bohemian ruler, because, as we just said, yes, he was essentially the strongest prince in Germany in that way, but not quite in the sense that from Bohemia he could simply try to take over like half of Germany, like his ancestor Ottokar II had partially succeeded in. Charles was also derisively labeled as Pfaffenkönig, so the priest's king, the Pope's king, due to the conditions surrounding his election, which is what Germans, at least those Germans who would not support the current ruler, would passively, aggressively state whenever he had risen to power with papal backing. There was this deep sense, especially stated by Ludwig of Wittelsbach, that now the German crown especially was just a German thing, which was also very anti-traditional in many ways, but that definitely didn't make, in fact, the prestige of Germany less hopefully connected to an ecumenic rule, and so of course also a partnership with the papacy. A large number of bishops in virtually all imperial cities remained loyal to Louis the Bavarian, because they thought that the Luxembourg was too powerful, at least speaking of the possible, say, papal interferences and just the consolidation of his secular rule in the country. Compounding his troubles, Charles chose the wrong side during the 100 Years' War, or at least, he found himself to back what seemed at the time the more convenient side, because, again, the great defeats of the French during the war were all clashes in which the French had a very strong advantage, so you can't be dumb in supporting them, really, and they were actually much more competent and capable than the notion that, again, they were just getting themselves impaled on the longbow arrows, which is not true, in fact. And this, anyway, led to the aforementioned loss of his father and many esteemed knights at the Battle of Crécy in August 1346, where he barely escaped with injuries. These were extremely brutal fights. There is all, you see now, a physical, like a human, personal component of these men, like spending your life on horseback as a man-at-arms, having to continuously confront yourself with your with the nobility that still hope for like some sort of peerage concession mirrored by the same power of their arms, is an incredibly demanding activity. This is not the time where kings just sit on a throne and or do so for most of their kingdoms. These were still extremely active from a political, but especially a military point of view, in ways that are really shocking in terms of individual involvement. Fortunately, the civil war in Germany was avoided when Louis IV passed away on October 11, 1347, after suffering a stroke during a bear hunt. What does Ludwig the Bavarian do in his late age? Like, he goes bear hunting, right? Because that's what you really do. And in line with what we just said about these people's lifestyle, they were old knights in many ways. Of course, the bear hunt has those deep traditional animal warfare. Think about the berserker. I am named after that. My Germanic surname refers specifically to the berserker. And in January 1349, supporters of the House of Wittelsbach attempted to elect Günther von Schwarzburg as king. I made an entire video about this guy, or better, about this guy's armor that is depicted in the Cathedral of Frankfurt on the guy's grave slab. These Hic-Jacet Miles, right? So these excellent sources for this point, mid-14th century arms and armor reconstruction. We are in the times, as you know, in which there is a pretty solid balance between plate, the newer plate, and the older mail, the complementary mail. Made multiple videos about different European knights. We look at this German anti-king because Günther's attire was very typical of the time. It has very specific, also, but always in the artisan dimension, very also distinctive characteristics in the mittens, in the helmet, etc. Now, this before, of course, von Schwarzburg died, he put up this resistance against Charles. It was basically the only guy at that point, after Ludwig's death, to stand his ground against Charles. However, he wasn't a great, very powerful leader, so he lacked substantial backing, was defeated by Charles during the siege of Eltville in May. This siege was pivotal in allowing Charles to solidify his claim to the Holy Roman Empire against his opponent. Günther's election by Charles' opponents had occurred in January 1349, with Günther's coronation in Frankfurt in February. And Charles, at that point, with a sizable army camped near Mainz, that, as you know, is not far away, and is said to have persuaded Louis IV's son, Louis V of Bavaria, to withdraw support from Günther. Because, again, the Wittelsbachs were still there opposing Charles, but they had been sensibly weakened by the death of their patriarch. And after the battle in which he was defeated, Günther signed a treaty. We are on May the 26th, relinquishing his claim to the throne of Germany 3 days later. In exchange, Günther's supporters received amnesty, which, was good at that point, and he was granted a financial settlement even. The guy would, however, die on June the 19th of the same year due to poisoning during the siege. Speaking of how things happen. And, of course, following this event, Charles faced essentially no immediate threats to his claim to the imperial throne. Right, he really managed to swiftly and quickly rise to power. Again, I made a video on the topic, much more in depth. You can check that out. Initially, Charles focused on fortifying his power, which is a good investment, especially with such, wandering father. Bohemia had largely been spared from the Black Death's effects, by the way. This is extremely important, very underrated to a degree. I mean, there are some parts of Europe that inexplicably remain untouched by the plague. At least we do not have evidence of the plague having caused too much trouble there. And some are actually very central places like Milan, for example. However, it's in Central Europe that apparently the largest areas were more spared. Bohemia was partly some of these lands, especially Poland. This would actually play an enormous role in the economical revival of these lands because they weren't, as you know, in Central Europe, especially in the Slavic territories, it wasn't this overwhelming, level of urbanization and endemic concentration or interconnection, etc. However, the fact that, say, the rest of Europe suffered this strong demographic blow, and that generally speaking, like most of, say, all these people equated to direct labor force, right? So there was, given the vast raw resources of these countries, mostly timber, grain, etc., the capacity to starting to export, especially during the crisis of this material on the markets due to the international shock, like an incredible amount of wealth, and having as a consequence these monarchies consolidating further. I made a video specifically about Poland regarding this, especially its 14th century. We'll talk about 14th century Poland as well. It's a very underrated chapter. But the same happened in Bohemia. And don't underestimate the effects of this pandemic, because the medieval economy, which is a pre-industrial system, also the population is very exposed to immunitarian at the immunitarian level. And so events like this would have, compared to our rhythms of growth or ridiculous crop yield and so on, is how you measure these economies, not being hit by a devastating plague that kills like a significant section of the population means actually a major to receive a major structural advantage, at least in relative terms, indirectly over the countries that are struck, right? And this does surely contribute to an importantly material and concrete level to the consolidation of the Central European crowns. Charles established Prague as his capital and committed to renovating the city in a Parisian style, founding the new town, by the way, Nowe Mesto. This is very interesting because Charles had also been deeply impressed by the Parisian art, like he styled like the crypt of the royal family after Saint Denis in Paris. It's very high, like imperial level kind of. We talk about the imperial essence of the French monarch and Gallicanism that was also very strong, at least in the previous decades, in the sense of grandeur, like a foundational, right, essential level of, sacred power of royal blood. This is true for many intellectuals that come to the court of Prague, from, as we will see now, far and wide. Prague is, to this day, right, one of the three major cultural capitals of Europe. We're talking Paris, Rome, and Prague. In fact, these are the true beating hearts of European culture in a say higher cultural, artistic, literary way. And much of Prague's ranking is owed to Charles himself, that in 1348 founds Charles University in Prague, named in his honor, in fact, marking the first university in Central Europe. This is also just to give an idea of what Central Europe had been up to that point, and in many ways how central Bohemia was in this enterprise. And Prague was not a young city, right? But the way it grew during these years is really enormous, not just in a material sense, but also in terms of prestige and spirituality, right? It blossoms further from the deeper seeds that had been sedimented by the Przemyslids in particular, and from a very long time. We talk Prague since the siege, the Ottonian sieges, like in the 10th century, right? So we will talk more about it. In the very heart of Europe. There is also a geographical dimension. There are some interesting, say, allegorical stamps, as you know, in the Middle Age and the early modern Europe, that represents Europe seen from the east, east down, like west up, like a woman, and her heart is Bohemia. really entrenched, like in the mountains, in the forest, with the center that is Prague. And this is very important because definitely Bohemia is located in the center of Europe, also as far as the traffics from north to south, east and west are concerned. This makes it a cultural crossroad across many different nations, trade, art, like political coordination, and especially at this point, it really maintains the compass of what had been the Catholic unity of Europe. It's extremely painful that Bohemia would be destroyed by the Hussites and lose independence as a consequence of being sort of a secondary level power in just one century. But just reflecting this sense how much was wasted by those heretics, given this grandeur to which they had sort of also rebelled in a deeper civilizational sense. But these are the horrors of the late medieval crisis in many ways. It tells you, however, how promising, how much potential there is in certain centers, especially in this seminal moment in which really the world doesn't know which direction to take it. Prague at this point could have really gone much more far, and some issues that were intrinsic, inherent, let's say, to the same system just prevailed. In any case, Charles University had an eminently statal monarchical institutional role. Like, it served as a training ground for bureaucrats and lawyers, establishing Prague as the region's intellectual and cultural hub, especially considering, which we will see in a while, of course, the connections with Rome, with Tuscany, with some of the greatest minds and humanists and artists of the year, that came from also many other countries, by the way, France, Germany, like you name them. Now, skillfully taking advantage of the challenges facing his rivals, Charles was re-elected in Frankfurt on June the 17th, 1349, which seemed quite appropriate given the what Gunther von Schwarzburg had done in the same cathedral, and recrowned also at Aachen on July the 25th, 1349, therefore consolidating the traditional Carolingian, it's not a coincidence here, with Charles, to a degree, legacy of the the Roman rulers. Charles soon became the unquestioned ruler of the empire, just out of this large-scale prestige. He garnered the support of the Rhenish and Swabian towns that, as we've seen, had been a bit distrustful, paranoid. These were free imperial cities that thought that, at least the Luxembourgs had some more oppressively centralistic projects for them. Instead, Charles essentially bought them through gifts and promises. He also secured a marriage alliance with the Habsburgs that you needed to do, even though they were also rivals of theirs, forming a partnership, however, especially with Ludwig's heirs, that had, again, now essentially split the Bavarian ducal estate in different branches that had now also gained control feudally of other parts of the empire. The partnership was especially established between Charles and Rudolf II of Bavaria, that was also Count Palatine of the Rhine, which would become, as you know, it already was, but was sanctioned by the Golden Bull as, one of the four secular electors of the empire, without being, by the way, a particularly powerful policy, really, at least compared to Austria or to Bohemia, or saying Brandenburg, that also was one of them, also at that point controlled by the Wittelsbachs. Not because these had again expanded in a, say, conquest sense. On the contrary, we made a video about the Margrave and Brandenburg, because a bit like in Bohemia originally with Luxembourg, like the local noblemen had decided to call somebody else that would therefore be indebted towards them and would hopefully not be that oppressive, as essentially also some sort of foreign ruler to somebody coming from another province. Charles also married Rudolf's daughter Anna after she had become a widower in 1348. This is very nice in general, like in the Luxembourg, Wittelsbach history, but they were all intertwined, as we've seen. St. Charles had Habsburgic blood, etc. Now, in 1350, Charles received a visit in Prague from the Roman tribune Cola di Rienzo, a very famous figure also because of the 19th century opera, but that is really central, in fact, to this time in history, and especially Charles IV's Prague. We will talk more. I made a video, I think, about Rienzi. It's called in different names. His name was actually different from this, but this was essentially a popular leader of Rome that essentially fought for the restoration of a Roman Republic under the papal blessings, reforming the city, trying to essentially stiffen the local communal forces against especially the overpower of the Roman barons that were always that strong, especially in the absence of the papacy running with free reign over the urbs. Naturally, Rienzi did sort of more controversial things as sort of even populist leader at different times of his rule, that at times were also enlightened. This was a very cultured person. He knew very much about ancient Roman history, the classics. It's probably the birth of humanism in Italy with Petrarch. We'll discuss now that we're all connected with Prague. In fact, Rienzi went to Prague as a prisoner because of these issues with the papacy that brought the same imperial forces to take control of the situation. And interestingly enough, while he was in prison, Rienzi taught the courtier of Prague like the good Latin letters in the most sort of refined humanistic reconstruction of the time, contributing to the Latinization of Charles' court and adding to his literary, linguistic, philological prestige, right? Because of course it wasn't like a harsh prison; it was a political one. And that's also why Charles became ever more interested in coming back to Italy, that, as we've seen, he had been in his youth, and that now Rienzi said, "Look, we're going to go there. Why don't we restore the Romanity of the empire, the old laws?" It was all part of that old imperial Catholic idea. Other key figure connected with the court of Prague at this point is the poet Petrarch, right? As well as other citizens of Florence, admittedly, that sought his presence. In part, we will see it better also in the next chapter about Florence, because Florence had been essentially a wealth power, and there was actually the political background is very complicated internationally, but at large, like now that we're seeing, as we've seen, the Luxembourgs as this non-particularly rapacious force in Italy that they could also gain something from his possible expedition or not in the peninsula. Petrarch, of course, is the single most cultured individual of his generation in Europe. He's the true father of humanism. He went over to Prague as essentially an imperial papal diplomat. Right, this guy had the perfect life of the era. He had enough money as a prelate, but he also had children profusely. He always wrote, however, mostly about his Laura, that was apparently an Occitan, a French princess, when he was at Avignon. He was obsessed with history, with manuscripts, and he, during his travels, his diplomatic missions, he traveled across all over Europe, visiting all the cathedral archives to search for Cicero, for any kind of classical manuscript, and refining its philological substance and polishing his Latin. He invented a new kind of writing was common at the time. The guy would die, apparently his servants would find him, dead over a manuscript of Cicero himself, if I'm not wrong. He talked with the dead. Like, it is a very, 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 very interesting figure. We have to talk about Petrarch because he is really a cut. And he journeyed at the court of Prague. And imagine just, being in a context of like touring, that this is what you really want, like touring mid-14th century Europe, far and wide. And from the Luxembourg side, with all the issues that he had, however, receiving this very pleasant, cultural input, especially in a land that was at large not particularly on the fore up to that point, and that broader, in terms of broader civilization. This is what is important about Charles Prague, that of course there was a lot of French culture, a lot of German culture. This is what also the Hussites would namely resent later, not because there was actually much of an opposition between the Germans and the Czechs, because since the Ostsiedlung and before, like, it was even difficult to say actually, still like today, what's German, what's Slav in many ways. But of course this court expressed a much higher hierarchy, something much more international, that was, as we've seen, coincident with the build-up of a very solid monarchy, something that the local nobility especially was not too thrilled of, unless they were co-opted. And so again, I talk a bit about the background of the Hussite, wars, and it's complicated. We never even ever talk about the Great Schism, too much about Hus. So we will have, I was saying before, to talk much more about especially late 14th century Europe and Bohemia, because it's so crucial to understand the war. Charles kept Kola prisoner for a year. He actually, Kola went over to Prague and Charles arrested him. Eventually he had him handed over to Clement at Avignon as a prisoner. In any case, Rienzi's history, as you know, is pretty dramatic, but it mostly unfolds in Rome, because it was taken out, of course, by the same Romans. Now, beyond Prague, Charles sought to expand the Bohemian crown lands as well, mostly through diplomatic, like political actions, as we explained before, like prolonged campaigns, like ruthless conquests, like particularly intense war efforts were really against the general possibilities of the time. It's not like he would have not done it had he had the possibility, but there were, of course, clever ways, and war can be actually the best solution, at least in theory, but more often than not, it isn't. In any case, he could wield now this enormous power as Holy Roman Emperor himself, and so again, mind the entire universal, almost magic-like aura that Bohemian Prague are shrouded in at this point. It's really big, and he, especially in Central Europe, he has this great leverage, and he manages, using his imperial authority, to obtain fiefs in Silesia, the Upper Palatinate, and Franconia, which form, well, the Upper Palatinate is not close to Bohemia. I'd say in the center of Germany is not too wide. There is Bohemia, in fact, it also enters a little bit. Franconia is also fundamentally connected to this area. Silesia is, as you know, in the east, and it was always contaminated. Video about, except the Upper Palatinate, we'll have to make videos about this, videos about each of these regions. That for the intense influence of Charles' policy constituted now what were called the New Bohemia, like a sort of wide, sort of median band encompassing central Germany, the Czech lands, an assembly of holdings like intended to link, in fact, this territory with the outer world as well, especially with the Bohemia with the Rhineland, right, for the Luxembourg ambition. The Rhineland were historically among the richest lands in Germany. That were the Roman ones, just like the south was notoriously always richer than the north. It was closer to, like, about the traffics with England, the the frontier with France that it also, well, not the Rhineland, but as we've seen also the broader area in the west was the sea of the ancestral possessions of the Luxembourgs with their duchy. So it's this regional scale power that you have to imagine. Nonetheless, the Bohemian estates were hesitant to support Charles in these ambitions because, as we said before, the nobility was a bit worried, to say the least, this immense power could bring to a reduction of their prerogatives. Of course, these lands were very difficult to control. At large, especially the West, was very fragmented. That's the point I wanted to make now. And there wasn't even this great power there. You know, all the major powers are mostly in the east of Germany now. But those lands are very fragmented as very rich, and that's why such a strong ruler wants to control it. But Germany was a mess, right? A feudal forest, right? Actually a feudal thorny bush of some sort that was incredibly difficult just to dislocate yourself within, and definitely not a cohesive one, not one that even the enormous power of Charles could now invert the process of disgregation that had been going on now for essentially a good century, right? Remember, this is just a century after the death of Frederick II of Swabia. You think a completely different time. This is how fast times, in a broader sense, other than a chronological one, really change. When Charles attempted to codify the Bohemian law through the, in fact, Majestas Carolina, this was the document, the legal code he issued in 1355, he faced considerable opposition. The local nobility had not called the Luxembourgs back in the day in just to be simply controlled in any aspect, even if, of course, this legal code was quite intelligent, was just in line with traditional handling of the nobiliary prerogatives. We're obviously pointing towards a greater constriction of power, which brought Charles, in fact, to wisely moderate his centralization efforts. This was like the greatest problem, like in Central Europe to begin with. Hence also his renewed interest toward Italy. Now, regarding this chapter, we should make the premise. Charles was a staunch advocate for the equality between papal and imperial powers. Again, he had risen to power on that premise with papal support, and he had to ideologically foster countering to Ludwig's sort of nationalistic. Now, that's the end of the rise of nation-state at the detriment of the universal powers that had characterized the previous decades. And Charles was, and this is also the beauty, the greatness of the Luxembourg here, because he not only advocated for strong, say, cooperation between the papacy and the empire, but truly stressed the fact that they could not really operate without one another, and that they were complementary. They were on different levels, but with the same, like, foundational role for one another. Thus, Charles pursued a policy of peace within Italy as well. Again, the main objective, as you've seen also in Central Europe, was to gain as much as possible, also through law, through new settlements, just to maintain this control on a legal basis, and then, of course, not really having many ways to enforce it, but still creating some precedents that, in fact, would be used also later, for example, by the Habsburgs, that would have to use the Golden Ball well after it was designed to mostly counter their own power. In 1354, Charles made his way across the Alps for the first time as a ruler. Right. Naturally, he had diplomatically paved his own way. More than else, the death of the Archbishop of Milan, John Visconti, that had strongly opposed the Luxembourg as a strong Ghibelline, fervent Ghibelline leader, had helped. The Visconti were, to eventually gain from the same Charles like further recognition of their standing in the imperial hierarchy. But it had traditionally been against the papacy. They continuously attempted to invade, in fact, central Italy from the north and essentially dominate on the entire Italic kingdom. Charles was accepted, also because he had, of course, to receive the Italic crown in Milan, in Lombardy traditionally, since the beginning of the Western Roman revival. Thus, he also came at this point to Italy without an army. Right, this was important. He would have been, again, he would have had his bodyguards, etc., etc. He would have been well also supported in case of any issue by some faithful local subjects, cities against others, and so on. In any case, he received the Lombard crown at St. Ambrose Basilica in Milan. We are on the day of the Epiphany of 1355. Charles was officially crowned emperor in Rome by a cardinal, though, on April the 5th, because the Pope was not in the Europe, it was in Avignon. But of course, this prelate had the powers, like the instruction to imperially crown Charles on April the 5th of the same year, 1355. Charles' main objective appeared to be the peaceful acquisition of the imperial crown, in line with a commitment made to Pope Clement. Despite the wishes of the Roman populace, he stayed in the city for merely a few hours for this reason. By the way, it's not like Italy was completely peaceful towards him, right? There were always some issues regarding what was going on. I mean, this is, again, mid-14th century Italy. It's a mess in many ways. Military-wise, lots of things going on. And, of course, Charles is not completely outside of it. Reason for which, he understands that there isn't much else he could do, especially without an army. And so, after effectively relinquishing all imperial rights in Italy to the local powers, the emperor crossed the Alps again, facing, by the way, the derisive remarks of Petrarch, but returning with significant wealth and enhanced prestige. Because it's as if he had been an emperor as king of the Romans, but of course now he had the full blessing and confirmation of that. Upon his return, Charles concentrated on the governance of the empire, which was just beginning to recover from the effects of the Black Death that had been raging for years, and that had definitely created so many issues. As we've seen, Bohemia had been spared, yes, but it's not like everything was fine. There were massive imbalances in general, and even though the local economies could profit from, if spared, if finding themselves in sort of unexpectedly better situation on the markets, they had to work for that, and it was the task of the local polities to make it happen. In 1356, you have the issuing of the notable Golden Bull to establish regulations for the election of the King of Germany, and that is including Bohemia, in the sense that at least Bohemia is one of the great electors. This is an incredibly sophisticated system, again, to leave the Habsburgs out, given the current political circumstances in the country. It's mostly like a Luxembourg-Wittelsbach deal to keep the Habsburgs out. In fact, that's so important for the Bavarians that even though they have more votes than the King of Bohemia, it actually has only Bohemia for himself, or at least his parity with Wittelsbach, also considering the influences on the Palatinate, will obey, will follow the Luxembourg's direction. Of course, we will make a video about the Golden Bull, because what was sanctioned is much more than this, and it would resonate in the centuries, giving a pretty accurate photography, let's say, of, if we can so say, of the times, juridical, administrative, institutional reality of the same Germany. I made a video about princely, a little series, let's say, about princely Germany. You can check out if you're interested about these centuries. And there are deep reflections in there. It's not just about Germany, it's about the role of Germany in the empire as well. And so this paradox, right, this issue, like essentially from mirroring like this shrinking from the ecumenic empire to Central Europe of the Germanic rulers. In fact, as we have seen, the same Charles had very strong connections with Italy, but he wasn't capable of carrying out any conquest campaign. He was just outside of their time. Like if you look at the campaigns of Henry VII, of Ludwig IV, and in fact John and Charles, you realize that there's a continuous shrinking of the size of the forces involved and an increasing dependency on the Italian rulers financially wise for even mounting up like modest expeditions from Central Europe. So it's really a big deal. In this institutional reorganization, Charles allocated Moravia to his brother John Henry and elevated the county of Luxembourg to a duchy for another brother, Wenceslaus. This is relevant because, of course, like the Luxembourgs haven't forgotten their ancestral possessions. As well, we'll again talk about the county/duchy of Luxembourg at a point for the regional series. Charles was tenacious in his pursuit of additional territories to reinforce the Bohemian monarchy. He really sought any possible excuse, like pretext, occasion to seize further territories. For example, he managed to acquire part of the Upper Palatinate in 1353 and annexed Lower Lusatia to Bohemia in 1367. The Lusatias are in the north of Bohemia, like between Poland and Germany. I talked a bit about these lands, if anything, with Silesia. Again, we talked about it for Middle Ages Bohemia as well. But I made some videos about the late medieval Habsburgs and the late medieval early modern Habsburgs concerning the interconnection between Bohemia, Austria, the Lusatias, and Silesia. When we say annexed to Bohemia, by the way, it means to the Bohemian crown, not to Bohemia proper, because these were free lands historically. You couldn't annexate them like to another land. They were historically, geographically, linguistically different from the Czechs. By the way, Germany was really there were like 300 states in there, so there are numerous little estates that across the various regions in Germany, Charles manages to subsume with some feudal system. After the death of Meinhard, the Duke of Upper Bavaria and Count of Tyrol, in 1363, Upper Bavaria was claimed by the offspring of Emperor Louis IV, while Tyrol was claimed by Rudolf IV, Duke of Austria. And here there is a deep intertwinement between the house of Gorizia, Tyrol, the Habsburgs, the Luxembourgs, the Wittelsbachs, and everybody tries, as we've seen, Charles has married Wittelsbach as well, and so Bavaria is fragmented in 4 chunks. After Rudolf IV, also the Habsburgs will separate in different chunks. It's sort of a big mess as a whole. In any case, Charles recognizes both the aforementioned claims, but stipulated that if these families became extinct, both regions would revert to the House of Luxembourg, right? So the Wittelsbachs could get Upper Bavaria, and the and Tyrol could be taken by Rudolf IV. However, like in case of extinction of the lineage, this territory will come back to the Luxembourg. This also tells you, by the way, how Charles could not go to war against these players that, even though he had meticulously tried to refrain through the Golden Bowl general settlement, could and would still control some also the most strategic pathways. We remember Tyrol, right? The one that the same Charles used for Italy. That he was not really could not be in direct control of, because actually between Italy and Bohemia there's just 300 kilometers, but in between you have the Habsburgs, you have Bavaria. It's not easy, right? And so this is also the leverage that these other powers could make on Bohemia, that yes was very central, but when it came to these kind of direct connections, as we've seen, reaching the Rhineland, reaching Italy, and so of course going closer to civilization, taking the reins of some more advanced player like was actually isolated, right? So there were many breaks still to the overall control that Charles' political opponents would exploit. Around this time, Charles was assured the succession to the Margravate of Brandenburg. This was the other major acquisition, which is really an enormous deal. Brandenburg had also coveted Bohemia at times when the Habsburgs had crushed Ottokar II. There was almost a huge battle, bigger than Markfeld, in the same 1278, when the Brandenburg and the Austrian armies met before accepting a situation of power sharing. Now it was the Luxembourgs that would be able to inherit for their dynasty this very important land, the bigger, the more powerful of the northeastern German marks. How? Well, Charles ultimately secured Brandenburg for his son Wenceslaus in 1373. As you know, it's always an in theory process, right? You may not know what would happen. Like, people did not leave very often as long as they would have expected, like much more than today's. There were very intricate political issues, but setting like the premises, like if anything, even just showing that you could secure a place in this way, like, was quite a display of power. On June the 4th, 1365, Charles became the last emperor to be crowned king at Arles. That's where he really recompacted all the four crowns of the empire for the first time in a single person. That same year, Amadeus VI of Savoy was designated as Imperial Vicar of Arles by Charles. We made a video about Savoy. We'll have to get a bit more in depth in the history of the dynasty, because these acted now as proxies in favor of, mostly detached, that they're from the other side of the empire compared to Bohemia, but to control better this quite molding reality. As you know, witnesses in the north, in the northeast, the rising Swiss Confederacy. It's mostly a problem from the Habsburgs that have some territories in Swabia, and what would be partly today's Switzerland, as well, that were being lost. In fact, at this moment, Savoy had historically coveted like a space west, mostly to the wider French territories of the plains, such as Dauphiné. These lands, by the way, were contended at this point between France and the Empire. At least there was this power vacuum whereby there was a general embarrassment regarding France gradually eating up like the Holy Roman Imperial land through feudal means, without sort of breaking the fact that there were imperial territories, but the fact of expanding them. But France was also very busy at this time, so it wouldn't be until the end of the Middle Ages that this embarrassing situation would be formalized. So Savoy was sort of the best player there to invest on, in order to have a strictly feudal authority responding to the imperial call and getting such power. However, given the temper of the times, not even the local Savoyard power was capable of, by imperial proxy, let's say, action to control effectively the kingdom of Arles. If anything, the Savoy were the more powerful power in the province, like from this side of the Alps in the southeast of France. But they hadn't been able, like, to historically to go through. Like, that was the Dauphiné. There were other potentates in the south that were historically also a bit outside properly the reach of Savoy, but mostly concentrated on the Italian side of the coast. In fact, Charles IV to restore imperial authority over the Kingdom of Art were unsuccessful as well. Nobody had really succeeded in doing so. That Rudolf of Habsburg had tried, the French too had sort of at a point, as you know, with Provence, maintained a foothold there, but it was always like a detached land at large. It's still an imperial fief. Very complicated situation. So in the year 1366, so just after 1 year after his own crowning as the King of Burgundy, Charles ceded his claim to the Arles crown to Louis I of Anjou, after transferring the county of Savoy to the Kingdom of Germany. This was quite relevant as well, because again, Savoy was floating a bit around, and it was expanding, especially on both sides, especially the Italian one, and so at large here, what happens is a definition of status quo, right, and essentially a failure for the imperial policy. Casimir III of Poland and Louis I of Hungary, we talked about both on Schwerpunkt, conspired, by the way, against Charles. These are the rival Central European powers that do not like such a powerful neighbor. That also come from sort of different backgrounds, different international situations. And what do these guys do? Like, essentially, they successfully enlist Otto V of Bavaria to their cause. It was essentially using a Wittelsbach for the historical enmity and contingential political alignments against the Luxembourgs in Germany. So you see how the area could be infiltrated by the Poles, by the Hungarians politically. Following Margrave Otto's repeal of the estate contract in early July 1371, Charles IV declared war and invaded the Margravate of Brandenburg, right? Because Otto was the temporary ruler of the Margravate that, as we've seen, had been promised to Charles' son. Poland and Hungary decide, at least convince Otto that he has to repeal that agreement, and at this point, open warfare unfolds. And this is actually a brutal clash, lasting 2 years, which that tells you how involved like these forces were and how difficult it was, even from Bohemia, to simply control this area that was, in theory, now just to pass under the Luxembourg's lineage. By the way, of course, this involved some German participation, but at large, there wasn't much that this Wittelsbach branch could do. And Brandenburg was integrated into the Czech crown in 1373. During this period, Charles ordered a survey of his new territory, including its villages, inhabitants, and revenues. Brandenburg was really extensive, right? And this survey is documented in the Landbuch of Charles IV. It was completed in 1375. This book mentions many villages for the first time, because northeastern Germany was really very primitive still at this point. Saying Frederick the Great would make some jokes about it. And it's such an important source, really, because it sheds light on the origins of many settlements in this particular corner of Europe. Charles also inherited a significant section of Silesia, a historically destabilized and sort of broken feudal state that swung. It would keep oscillating between the crowns of Bohemia and Poland. Historically, both powers had always tried to infiltrate in this territory. It was so hyper-fragmented. There were some Piests still ruling there, would rule until the Renaissance. There were like 17 districts that all did a bit what they wanted. And the ability of Charles to inherit at least a significant part of this territory happens through his third wife, that is Anna von Schweidnitz, that was the daughter of Henry II, the Duke of Schweidnitz. So that's the Slavic. I mean, it's the other way around, but you understand that. And Catherine of Hungary. In 1365, Charles also visited Pope Urban V in Avignon and pledged to escort him to Rome. It was during this occasion that he was crowned King of Burgundy at Arles, because you go all the way, Avignon is next door. This visit also opens the gates to the third and final Italian expedition in Charles' lifetime. This journey occurred in 1368, where he met the Pope Urban V in Viterbo in the north of Rome. And this expedition was a bit more impositive on the local territory, because Europe was beginning to revive, and Charles probably felt like the heat, the pressure of keeping all this big system together. And many Italians also rebelled to him. It was difficult to control Rome. He was besieged in his palace in Siena, by the way, and he abandoned Italy before the end of 1369 under much pressure, and essentially witnessing his control of the favor, the support of different Italian states like slipping off his hands, like breaking under his feet. And so Italy was going towards a different direction. It was essentially a revival, a very much local revival of power. This was almost the end of the soldier of fortune's times. Probably the Italian condottieri would rise also as local lords that would be enfeoffed by various rulers. It's a very interesting period. Again, we'd never talk about the 50s, the 60s of medieval, of 14th century Italy. But it's a very fascinating time. In his old age, Charles was minimally involved in German matters, aside from ensuring the election of his son Wenceslaus as king of the Romans in 1376. He also mediated peace between the Swabian League of Cities and various nobles in 1378. We talked about this in the video about princely Germany. In other words, Charles preferred just to remain an observer, not to spend resources, mostly paving the way to his son's succession. As, say, some germs of the new world were appearing, right? He died after distributing his lands among his three sons and his nephews in November 1378 in Prague. This is a very specific time, as it's the beginning of the Great Schism. So this new parenthesis that would last until 1417, and that will see a great deal of the world involving Bohemia, at least, being making the country like an international issue because of the spread of heresy, of some tensions. In fact, under his successor reign, in a new scale of political interaction, right? Charles was buried in Prague. He had been suffering from gout, so metabolic arthritis, that, as you know, was very common among the nobility during that era. We have uric acids, like so bringing to infection of mostly like your legs, and it was a matter of lifestyle, also partly of diet. In any case, you see also again this bodily dimension at the time. And it's interesting to think of the decay of this man in, again, such a specific year, thinking where he came from. Like the fact that this guy, as a youth, had been fighting and winning victories in Italy. In an era that seemed like the end of the great medieval civilization, the one in which there were still, say, in a recognizably international struggle, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, in which there were still resources to make things work, in which the Kingdom of France was not yet into the 100 Years' War, and it felt like the great state that nobody would imagine would undergo that crisis. And passing through, in fact, this incredibly, arriving to this end of the 14th century where literally everything has changed. Like there's been this major intercontinental crisis that will shrink Europe, will not come back on her feet, if not in 300 years, comparatively. And with this major ideological collapse of universal power, the nationalization of regional powers, but also the further fragmentation, especially in Central Europe, this hopelessness in terms of any capacity of recompaction, the further entrenchment of princely privileges. Think about, these are the times of the Habsburgic defeats against the Swiss. This seems like a world upside down, really, and something that Charles would have had to acknowledge. If you look also at the end of his life, lack of particular activity, he had been born again in 1316. This was a time in which, I don't know, all the grandeur of the great houses of the Habsburgs, of the Wittelsbachs, of the Anjou was so alive, was so close to the heyday of glory. It was in the heyday of glory. And you arrive at the end of the 14th century where everything is exhausted. It's unrecognizable, it's darker. There is this plague, this black death ravaging the land, and there is a general sense of misery and exhaustion. You have the Turks swarming into the Balkans. You have a situation that nobody really, at the time of this guy's birth, would have imagined. And it's true that times changed not as fast as today in many ways, but in the way they did in relative terms, and the way these people's ideologies and powers were entrenched in it are unlike anything else. Like they are that we can experience today. They're much more sort of complicated to handle. There is this intrinsic limits, not even the splendor of Luxembourg. Prague can do much about it. In fact, that's also the point. Like there is a lot of masking of prestige. There is a lot of great limits in the way that this power is actually wielded. And there are some also changes that have been created by you, really. Think about the Golden Bull, that will really settle matters for Germany up to the 30 Years' War, really. There is a general sense of necessity to settle things down, to give some sound responses in a moment of crisis, where otherwise your entire political consensus will collapse at a point. And there is also a relative lack from the side of Charles. This is also the grandeur of the Luxembourgs that in hindsight seems also a relatively easy aspect of it all. That is to say, there wasn't any major power that Bohemia had to contrast. Whereas this massive estate that has historically resisted, that had paradoxically, even when defeated by other powers, stuck together while these were feudally fragmenting because of the great crisis of the German monarchy, and so apparently rising again like a phoenix. That today we didn't discuss it, but there is all the issue of the Teutonic Order, the relations with Poland. So the reign of Charles is complicated, to say the least, but it's also quite stable, thanks to a series of historical coincidences, power alignments, and more that are sometimes practically impossible to simply predict. But again, if you just look at the map of 1356 Europe of the Holy Roman Empire that I uploaded before, you have realized that there is, for example, there is this eastern frontier, Silesia, so the Duchy of Olesnica, Glogov, those are also in Lusatia. Like you have the Duchy of Opole, Opava, Brzeg, Breslov, Lineage, etc. These are Svitnica, the Duchy of Svitnica, the Bishopric of Niza, etc. These are all powers we could talk about at some point that form some sort of big belt, security belt, at the frontier with the Kingdom of Poland. That has its own issues. It has the Lithuanians from one side, the Teutonic Order from the other. This is before the alliance, the union, right? Have the Kingdom of Hungary. It also has some internal issues, but as we've seen, it's viciously infesting the same Germany. But if you look at Germany, practically it's a total mess of fragmented powers. That Italy is nothing in comparison to, and basically the major conglomerations are actually in the eastern part, like the Electorate of Brandenburg, the Duchy of Pomerania, the Habsburgic possessions in southeast Germany, in part because, again, these were historically less developed places, at least to an extent, and they, in terms of quality, especially the Slavic lands, or the ones that were taken from the northern marks, by the northern marks from the Slavs, that compact, because they don't have even the internal powers growing within it that can threaten that order, right? So that's the level, actually, of this is true also for the Scandinavian powers, etc. We'll talk about other powers, like, I don't know, the County of Schwerin, Kiel. Still have to talk about so many of these places. At times they're also so small that I doubt I'm ever going to make a specific video entirely on that can last at least 2 hours, because yes, you can always find some information you can spend, but by hierarchy there are other powers that are interesting to observe. There is also this Italian journey that is fueled a bit by the same Avignon papacy to maintain alignment, to harass at times the lordship of Milan. But again, think of that guy at the Battle of San Felice in 1332, and then think about the guy who died in Prague in 1378. The world happened in between. I mean, the Black Death changed everything in so many ways, and whenever I make these videos, I try to stress how relevant these things are for those who lead them, for those who really saw them happening. And there you have so many. Petrarch talked a lot about this in his Petrarch is a great soul of the time that really exemplifies this, because it's, he was a sheltered man. He was a sensual, passionate, say a romantic, tendentially melancholic individual who had this great luck of having such a life, but he was continuously complaining about, the eternal pessimist, about the time goes by and I don't know what to do, all the kind of things like that. But he was living the best of his life, and yet you understand this sense of withdrawal. This happens at every sort of civilizational crisis. People want to shelter away. They don't want to face reality. They don't want to accept what's going on. They want to have a different they want to redraw things, and the general culture suffers of that, because it's not like civilization is defective per se. It's people who are defective. In as such, there's actually a collapse. There's actually a loss in in real power, in real control, and that's something that I think Charles would have really understood in quite a central way. Also considering that his beginnings had truly been spirited by the aforementioned sense of wanting to recover the unity of the empire, wanting to recover the centrality of the papal imperial relations, which may have been part of that older mentality, that sense of once we got it, we must have it again. I remember that this guy is the grandson of Henry VII, who died in Italy during the imperial expedition that was about to knock out the Angevins of Naples. Like, just think about what it means to live up to this legacy in a moment in which basically the greatest issues had happened back in the day. His father had been born in the 1200s, and you can imagine even we said it before, like the chivalric ethos that was so much running in the veins of these rulers at the time. This is so important when you consider the man, when you consider the era. You can't not take it into account. And when you realize that this world of theirs was lost in ways that, again, were quite brutal, were quite irreversible, because when there is the Black Death, what the hell do you do? Like, it's not like you can oppose yourself. You have to think even about the times, like, well, what is my future? What is my role? Especially as a universal ruler. That's a hell of a question, and not just answered by wishful thinking. You really do go into a fair amount of depth in that realization, and you that there is something about the sense of the world burden on you. And then there is also in some ways, the different spirit. I mean, this guy was essentially Western Europe. At least the family was very much connected to Western Europe, as we've seen the same. I mean, they were technically by culture. Also, Charles was raised at the French court, so he would have known what that meant. Then he would have known what Italy meant, and still, like, there was this dimension of Central Europe. I mean, John of Bohemia went on fighting in the Baltic Crusade, just to make an example. So you have, Germany, Bohemia, and you realize you're stuck with these. Like, these are your core lands. They're the more prestigious, with the ones to which your honor is tied to. And it's interesting that Charles was connected with Bohemia. Charles, by the way, was a kind of cold, practical. Say, you can't say impositive because he rarely used the iron fist, but when he did, he was cool in realizing the necessity. But he also had a kind of measure that it's sort of typical of those times, mostly because of the shortages of power, and that made him prefer this Central European reality, also for practical reasons. Maybe he wasn't that sentimental, but he had a role, a mission to fulfill, and this passed through the realization that it was necessary from Prague, and also for the expectation of his own dynasty, what would happen when he was gone. We would be gone. He had to leave a legacy, and he left undoubtedly, like in history, one of the greatest legacies in the history of the world, right? It in a very underrated way, but by the fact that it seemed again that all these moments of grandeur had passed, but really showing that was much more yet to be spent, and surely such a great power to found in the center of Europe when really making it. Nevertheless, I'm glad that we finally talked about Charles. I recently made a video about Bohemian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century. We'll come back on the Hussites at some point, because from a general eventual point of view, I think we never talk about the Hussite wars at large, right? About Ziska, about how everything unfolded, let's say. Nevertheless, the Bohemian history is an evergreen in many ways. I know that many of you enjoy this. That's why I also prepare this sometime. I mean, as you know, I'm very... I always try to give the due amount of space to all those who deserve them, right? So that I don't leave anyone behind or out. Nevertheless, there is sometimes like an importance, very specific time, and for a medieval history channel not having covered say Charles IV would have not been that nice, so I thought to compensate for this. Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. We'll keep talking about Charles of Bohemia in other videos. For today, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.